The glass shattered inward with a sound that split the winter silence like a gunshot. Marcus Brennan's boot connected with the doorframe a second time, splintering wood that had survived 40 northern winters but couldn't withstand the force of a man who'd breached harder barriers in darker places. Ash, the German shepherd at his side, didn't wait for permission. Her silver-gray body slipped through the opening, nose-low muscles coiled beneath fur that caught the moonlight filtering through broken windows. The diner smelled wrong. Not the usual blend of old grease and coffee grounds that clung to every wooden surface, but something sharper underneath. Chemical. Deliberate. Marcus registered it the same way he'd registered danger in Afghan villages where the air tasted like metal and fear. Ash growled a low vibration that started deep in her chest and meant only one thing. Target acquired. The basement door hung open at the far end of the kitchen, spilling weak yellow light across linoleum that hadn't been replaced since the 80s. Marcus moved toward it, his boots silent despite his size. 6 feet 2 inches of controlled momentum shoulders that still carried the width of military discipline, even though he'd turned in his uniform 3 years ago. His hand found the railing wood, worn smooth by decades of hands that had descended these same stairs for reasons that probably started innocent and ended here in this moment, with him following his dog into someone else's nightmare. Sarah Mitchell lay crumpled against the far wall of the basement, her body twisted at an angle that spoke of collapse rather than rest. A pill bottle had rolled from her hand, orange plastic bright against concrete gray. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular rhythms that Marcus had seen before in men who'd ingested things they shouldn't have willingly or otherwise. Evelyn Morse stood between them and the stairs. The knife in her hand wasn't particularly large, just a paring blade from the kitchen upstairs, but size mattered less than intent. At 60-something, heavy-set and gray-haired, she should have looked like someone's grandmother. Instead, she looked like exactly what she was, a woman who'd run out of options and decided violence was the only currency left. Marcus stopped 3 steps from the bottom. Ash positioned herself between him and the older woman, teeth bared just enough to be unmistakable. The knife trembled slightly in Evelyn's grip. Her knuckles had gone white around the handle veins, standing out against skin that looked paper-thin in the harsh overhead bulb. "You can't take her." Her voice cracked on the words, but the blade stayed level. "She's mine. She owes me." Marcus kept his hands visible, palms open at his sides. "Put the knife down, Evelyn. We both know you're not going to use it." "You don't know anything." Spit flecked her lips. 20 years I've given her. 20 years. She'd be dead without me. Dead on some street corner or in some ditch, and now you think you can just—" Ash lunged, not to attack but to create opening. Her 70-pound frame hit Evelyn at hip level, enough force to send the older woman staggering sideways. The knife clattered against concrete. Marcus was already moving past Ash, dropping to his knees beside Sarah. Her skin felt clammy under his fingers when he checked her pulse. Too slow. Too weak. The pill bottle was still half full, but that didn't mean she hadn't swallowed enough to stop breathing in the next 10 minutes. Behind him, Evelyn was screaming. Not words anymore, just raw sound, the kind that came from watching something you'd built with cruelty and patience finally collapse. Ash kept her pinned against the washing machine in the corner, not biting, just holding position with the steady attention of an animal trained to understand the difference between threat and target. Marcus gathered Sarah into his arms, lighter than she should have been, all sharp angles under the denim shirt that hung loose on her frame. Her head lolled against his shoulder, brown hair falling across a face that might have been pretty once before fear became the default setting. "This isn't over." Evelyn's voice followed him up the stairs. "You hear me? This isn't—" The rest dissolved into the January night as Marcus kicked through the front door and headed for his truck. Ash fell into step beside him, mission complete, alert for new threats. The town was dark at 2 in the morning. Windows shuddered against cold that came down from Canada and settled into these northern valleys like something with weight. Ice crystals hung in the air, catching in Marcus's breath as he fumbled with the truck door. Got Sarah laid across the back seat, her breathing still shallow but steady enough that he could take the 4 minutes to the emergency clinic without watching her die. Ash jumped into the passenger seat, looked back at their cargo, then forward through the windshield as Marcus fired the engine. Her amber eyes reflected the dashboard lights, calculating and calm. She'd found what she'd been trained to find. The rest was just cleanup. But before any of that, before the breaking glass in the basement and Evelyn's knife, there was the first morning. The moment when everything that followed became inevitable, though Marcus didn't know it yet. Neither did Sarah. Probably only Ash understood, in whatever way her military-trained brain processed the world, that some doors shouldn't be opened and some dangers couldn't be ignored. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus Brennan arrived in the northern town without ceremony. No welcome committee, no questions about where he'd come from or what he wanted. Just another man in a pickup truck with out-of-state plates pulling into the gravel lot of the Pine View Motel at dusk on a Wednesday. The clerk barely looked up from her crossword puzzle when he paid cash for a week in advance. Room 7 around back, he'd included checkout at 11. He'd chosen this place for its silence. 20 years in the Army left him allergic to noise that didn't mean anything, conversation that filled space without carrying weight. The town sat at the edge of a pine forest that stretched north into territory where cell towers gave up and road signs warned about moose. A cold lake pressed against the eastern boundary, its surface reflecting sky and shades of gray that matched the season. Population somewhere around 1,500, give or take, whoever had left since the last census and whoever had arrived to replace them. Ash adapted faster than he did. The first morning she woke him at 05:30 out of habit, nails clicking against the motel room's thin carpet until he gave up trying to sleep in and pulled on jeans and the flannel jacket that had become his civilian uniform. She was 6 years old now, maybe 7, depending on which vet records you believed. A German shepherd with a coat that ran silver gray along her back and cream at her chest, darker around her ears where the fur stood up in permanent alert. Her left ear carried a scar from an IED fragment in Kandahar that had killed the handler before Marcus and sent 3 more soldiers home in bags. She'd survived with stitches and a new assignment, working beside Marcus for the last 3 years of his deployment until they both retired on the same paperwork. They walked together through morning that tasted like snow preparing to fall. The main street ran north-south through town, lined with buildings that had weathered a century of these winters and would probably weather a century more. A hardware store, its windows displaying snow shovels and ice melt. A post office sharing space with a real estate office. A bar that wouldn't open for another 12 hours. And on the corner where the street dead-ended into the lake road, a diner with a hand-painted sign that creaked slightly in the wind. Mitchell's Diner, though someone had painted over the name years ago and replaced it with just Diner in letters that didn't quite match the original font. The building was all wood, weathered to the gray-brown that happened when paint gave up fighting the elements. Windows fogged with interior heat promising coffee and warmth against the 17-degree morning. Marcus headed for the door. Ash stopped. Her body went rigid 3 feet from the entrance, every muscle suddenly engaged. Her ears swiveled forward, locked on something Marcus couldn't perceive. The low rumble started in her chest, not aggressive, not yet, but a warning that pinged every combat instinct he'd spent 3 years trying to bury under civilian routine. What is it? He kept his voice quiet, conversational. To anyone watching from inside, they were just a man talking to his dog. Not unusual. Except Ash hadn't stopped moving like this since Afghanistan, and that had been for mortar fire. She didn't look at him. Her focus stayed fixed on the diner, specifically on the back section visible through the front windows. The kitchen area maybe, or the hallway that probably led to storage and a rear exit. Her nose worked the air, pulling in information he'd never be able to read. Chemical signatures, emotional residue. Whatever dogs processed that let them find bombs under 3 feet of dirt or track a runner through a forest. Marcus scanned the visible interior. Early morning meant sparse crowd, maybe 5 people total scattered across booths and counter seats. Nobody looked particularly dangerous. Nobody looked particularly anything, just folks nursing coffee and watching the day arrive. He tried the door. Ash didn't follow. Her body remained locked, a living barrier between him and whatever she'd detected. In Kandahar, this meant stop immediately and call EOD. Here it meant something was wrong in ways he couldn't quantify yet, but 3 years of trusting this animal's judgment had kept him alive through situations where human eyes failed. All right, he stepped back from the door. We'll try somewhere else. Ash relaxed incrementally enough to turn and walk back down the street with him, but she kept glancing over her shoulder, tracking the diner like it might follow them, like it was the threat, not just the location of one. They found coffee at a gas station instead, bitter and thin, served in cups that burned through cheap paper. Marcus drank it standing in the parking lot while Ash sat at his heel and watched the street. The diner stayed in her peripheral attention, a fixed point in whatever threat map she maintained. The next morning he tried again. Same time, same walk, same destination. Ash stopped at the same spot, same rigid attention, same low warning growl that meant danger ahead, proceed with extreme caution or not at all. This time, Marcus ignored it. Not out of disrespect, but because patterns demanded investigation. If Ash reacted once, that was anomaly. Twice suggested consistency. Consistency meant data worth collecting, even if the collection carried risk. The door chimed when he pushed through brass bell hanging from a leather strap. Inside smelled like every diner in America, coffee and bacon grease and maple syrup forming a permanent aromatic layer. The floor was linoleum, cracked in places, patched in others. Booths lined the windows, red vinyl split and repaired with duct tape. A counter ran along the back wall, chrome stools bolted to the floor at regular intervals. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 60s, heavy through the middle, gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful. She wore a wine-colored sweater under a white apron that had seen better decades. Her eyes were sharp when they landed on Marcus, the kind of assessment that came from years of measuring people before they ordered. Seat yourself. Not welcoming, not hostile. Transactional. Marcus took a booth near the window where he could watch both the door and the interior. Ash remained outside, visible through the glass, still staring at the building with that fixed attention that made his shoulders tight. The woman approached with a coffee pot, flipped the cup already waiting on the table, and poured without asking. She moved with brisk efficiency, keys clinking at her waist. A ring of them, maybe a dozen, hanging from a metal clip. Every movement made them chime slightly tiny bells announcing her location. Menus on the table. Breakfast all day, sandwiches after 11. She was already turning away when Marcus stopped her. Coffee's fine for now. She paused, glanced back. Her gaze flicked to the window where Ash sat, then returned to his face with something that might have been calculation. Dog stays outside. She will. Another pause, longer this time, then a nod, and she was moving again back toward the kitchen. The keys kept chiming fainter as distance grew. Marcus cataloged the space properly now. 5 other customers, 2 men in work boots and Carhartt jackets, sharing a booth, probably construction or forestry. An elderly woman with the newspaper spread across her table, reading glasses perched on her nose. A younger guy, maybe 30, hunched over his phone at the counter, and one more person. A woman working behind the counter, younger than the first, moving between coffee pot and kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd walked these paths thousands of times. She was maybe late 30s, slender, average height, brown hair pulled back in a simple knot, loose strands escaping around her face. She wore a faded denim shirt with sleeves rolled too far down for the diner's interior temperature, a brown canvas apron tied at her waist, and an expression of careful neutrality that reminded Marcus of soldiers trying not to draw attention in hostile territory. She refilled the old woman's coffee, collected plates from the counter, wiped down surfaces that didn't look particularly dirty. Small movements, economical, designed to complete tasks without creating notice. When the older woman with the keys called something from the kitchen, the younger one moved faster, shoulders drawing inward slightly. Marcus watched the dynamic through 3 more interactions. The older woman, Evelyn, based on the name tag he could just make out, issued instructions in a voice that didn't quite rise to the level of sharp, but carried edges underneath. The younger woman, no name tag visible, responded immediately. No questions, no hesitation. When she reached for a coffee pot at the same moment Evelyn did, she pulled back so fast she nearly knocked over a creamer. Ash, visible through the window, kept her eyes locked on something in the back of the diner. Not the customers. Not Marcus. Her attention tracked the movements of the 2 women, but specifically her body tensed when Evelyn moved close to the other one. Marcus tested it, waited until Evelyn went into the kitchen, leaving the younger woman alone at the counter. Through the window, Ash relaxed fractionally. Not much, but enough that her ears shifted from forward-locked to normal scan pattern. Then Evelyn returned, came up beside the younger woman to adjust something about how she'd arranged the pastries in the display case. Ash's hackles rose, not fully, just the slightest ridge along her shoulders, and that low growl started again. The younger woman flinched when Evelyn reached past her, a full-body jerk that she tried to disguise as reaching for a rag. But Marcus had seen it. Muscle memory of expecting impact, the kind that developed after enough repetitions that the body stopped waiting for certainty and just reacted to proximity. He kept watching. The diner filled slowly as the morning progressed, locals drifting in for their routines. The 2 women worked around each other in patterns that looked choreographed but felt wrong, like dancers who'd practiced together so long they'd forgotten there were supposed to be moments when they weren't in each other's space. At one point, something crashed in the kitchen. A metallic bang, sharp and sudden. The younger woman dropped the plate she'd been holding, jerked so hard that coffee slopped over the rim onto her hand. She didn't cry out, just grabbed a towel and cleaned the spill with trembling fingers while her face went carefully blank. Through the window, Ash stood, not barking, not aggressive, but on her feet, body positioned between the diner and the street. Her teeth showed slightly, a warning to something only she could perceive. Evelyn emerged from the kitchen, face flushed, eyes bright with something that looked like anger or fear, or maybe both. She took in the broken plate, the spilled coffee, the younger woman's shaking hands. "Clean that up properly. And don't waste any more today, or it comes out of your pay." The younger woman nodded without speaking, without making eye contact, just bent to collect the ceramic shards, movements quick and precise. Evelyn's gaze swept the diner, landed on Marcus. Held there for a beat too long. Then she was moving toward him, keys announcing her approach. "Your dog's making noise." Not exactly accusatory, but close. Marcus glanced out the window. Ash hadn't made any audible sound that he'd heard, but maybe she'd missed the timing. "She's fine, just keeping watch." "Watch for what?" Evelyn's hands found her hips keys, jangling with the movement. "Habit. Military training doesn't turn off easy." Something shifted in Evelyn's expression. Not fear exactly, but reassessment. Her eyes narrowed slightly, measuring him again with new parameters. "You're new in town. Passing through. Maybe staying a while." "We get a lot of that. People passing through thinking they'll stay, finding out there's not much reason to." She paused. "Your dog's not bothering customers, but if she gets aggressive, you'll need to take her elsewhere." "She won't." Marcus kept his voice level, conversational. "She only reacts to threats." Evelyn's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "There aren't any threats here, just breakfast and coffee and people trying to make a living." She walked away before he could respond, back toward the kitchen where the younger woman was still collecting broken pieces. The keys chimed with each step, a sound that was probably supposed to project authority, but reminded Marcus more of shackles. He left cash on the table, more than the coffee cost, and headed out. Ash fell into step beside him the moment he cleared the door, her body still coiled but relaxing as distance grew. When they were a block away, she finally sat and looked up at him with those amber eyes that had seen IEDs and firefights, and situations where reading the environment correctly meant survival. "Yeah." He rested a hand on her head, felt the tension thrumming through her skull. "I saw it too." Over the next week, Marcus returned to the diner every morning. Same time, same booth when it was available, different seat when it wasn't. Ash stayed outside, maintaining her vigil through the window. The pattern held with mathematical consistency. When Evelyn moved away from the younger woman, Ash relaxed. When Evelyn moved close, Ash tenseled. When the two women interacted directly, Ash's body language screamed danger in the same register she'd used in Afghanistan when the dirt looked wrong and the air smelled like explosives wrapped in diesel fuel. Marcus learned the younger woman's name on day 3 when Evelyn snapped it across the diner after she'd apparently taken too long with a customer's order. Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. Though the Mitchell part came later, overheard in a conversation between the elderly woman with the newspaper and another regular who asked after Mary and John's girl and got told that was 20 years ago and best not bring it up. Sarah arrived before dawn each morning. Marcus knew because he started walking past the diner at 5 a.m. early enough that the street was empty and lights were just coming on inside. Through the windows he could see her moving through opening procedures alone, wiping tables, starting coffee prep work that should have been shared but apparently wasn't. She left long after closing. Marcus confirmed this by accident the first time heading out for a late walk when insomnia hit harder than usual. 11:30, and Sarah was still inside mopping floors while Evelyn stood near the register counting receipts. The older woman's posture radiated supervision, not participation. During the days Sarah worked with the same careful efficiency Marcus had noticed that first morning. She never sat unless Evelyn gave explicit permission, which seemed to happen rarely. She never ate in view of customers, just disappeared into the kitchen for minutes at a time before returning to refill coffee or clear tables. Her shirt sleeves stayed rolled down even when the diner's heat kicked into levels that had other workers shedding layers. Once reaching for something on a high shelf, the fabric pulled back enough to show her wrist. Yellow-green bruising, faded but visible. Old enough to be healing, not old enough to be forgotten. She never made eye contact with customers unless directly addressed, and even then her gaze skittered away after the minimum required interaction. When Evelyn called her name, Sarah's shoulders drew inward fractionally before she turned to respond. Small adaptation, probably unconscious, the body's attempt to present less target. Marcus watched it all with the patience he'd learned in surveillance operations, where a week of observation meant the difference between actionable intelligence and dead contractors. He watched how Sarah flinched at sudden sounds, how she checked Evelyn's location before making any decision, even small ones like which table to clear first, how she moved through the space like someone navigating a minefield where the explosives shifted daily and the only safety was in never drawing attention. Through all of it, Ash maintained her assessment from outside. Marcus started documenting the pattern in a notebook he kept in the truck. Evelyn approaches Sarah. Ash alert. Evelyn corrects Sarah's work. Ash growls. Evelyn touches Sarah's shoulder. Ash stands, teeth visible. Evelyn leaves the building. Ash relaxes completely. On day 7, an older man joined Marcus at his booth. Late 60s, maybe early 70s, with white hair cropped military short and a face mapped with the kind of lines that came from decades of squinting into sun and weather. He wore a brown wool coat worn soft at the elbows and moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose knees didn't quite track straight anymore, but who'd adapted to the limitation. "Mind if I sit?" He was already settling into the opposite bench, coffee cup in hand, not really waiting for permission. Marcus gestured at the space. "It's a free country." "Frank Hollis." He extended a hand across the table, grip still firm despite the years. "Noticed you've been coming in regular, you and that shepherd of yours." "Marcus Brennan." The handshake was brief, professional. "Ash usually waits outside." "Smart dog. I had a Belgian Malinois back in the day. Best partner I ever worked with, and that includes 2 ex-wives and a business partner who embezzled $40,000 before I caught him." Frank's smile carried the weight of stories he'd probably told enough times that the edges had worn smooth. "You're military?" Not a question. Marcus nodded anyway. 20 years. Got out 3 years back? Army. Most of it. Some other work that didn't come with clear job descriptions. Frank's eyes crinkled with understanding. "The kind where you don't talk about it at dinner parties." "The kind where you don't get invited to dinner parties." That earned a short laugh. Frank sipped his coffee, gaze drifting to where Sarah was refilling the pastry case near the counter. His expression shifted, something that might have been regret or old anger, or both, settling into the creases around his mouth. "Your dog," he said after a moment. "She react to anything specific or just the building in general?" Marcus considered the question, the deliberate casualness of it. "Why do you ask?" "Because I've been watching you watch things for a week now, and I'm guessing you've noticed what most folks around here decided was easier not to notice." Frank kept his voice low, conversational volume that wouldn't carry past their booth. "Sarah's been working here 15 years, give or take. Longer than most people stay at any job, especially one that doesn't pay much and runs you morning to night. You know her. Know of her. Small town. You know of everybody whether you want to or not." Frank rotated his coffee cup between both hands, studying the surface. "Her parents owned this place 20 years ago, John and Mary Mitchell. Good people, ran a decent operation, treated their staff fair. Then they died in a car accident up on Highway 7. Ice storm, lost control, went off the embankment. Sarah was 19, just finished high school, hadn't decided about college yet. Suddenly she's got no parents, no siblings, just a diner she didn't know how to run, and grief she couldn't process." Marcus waited. Outside, Ash shifted position but maintained her watch. "Evelyn was the manager back then. Had been for maybe 5 years. She stepped up, told Sarah she'd help run things until the girl got her feet under her. Seemed like kindness at the time." Frank's mouth twisted. "That was 20 years ago. Sarah's still here, still working. Evelyn's still managing. Only somewhere along the way the arrangement changed and nobody quite remembers when or how." "What kind of change? The kind where one person makes decisions and the other one follows them. The kind where questions stop getting asked because the answers might be uncomfortable." Frank finally looked directly at Marcus. "You asked about your dog. I'm asking you, what's she reacting to? What's she seeing that the rest of us got too used to ignoring?" Marcus glanced at Sarah, currently wiping down a table while Evelyn supervised from near the register. The younger woman's movements were quick, efficient, and carried that same edge of anticipatory flinch he'd catalogued all week. "Fear," he said quietly. "Ash is trained to detect explosives, but she's also trained to read threats. She's not reacting to the building. She's reacting to a person?" Frank absorbed this with a slow nod. "Evelyn. Evelyn. And what does that tell you?" "That Sarah's afraid of her. Consistently. Predictably. The kind of fear that's become baseline rather than response to specific incidents." Marcus paused. "Which means it's not new. It's maintained." The older man was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of confession. "There was another girl. Before Sarah. Maybe 25 years ago now. Lisa something. Brennan, I think. She worked here for a couple years, then one day she was just gone. Evelyn said she'd left, moved on, didn't give notice. Most people accepted it. Young folks drift in and out of towns like this all the time." "But you didn't accept it." "I was a cop then. 30 years on the force before I retired. And I remember thinking it was odd that Lisa left without collecting her last paycheck. Without taking her stuff from the room she rented above the hardware store. Without saying goodbye to the couple people in town she'd made friends with." Frank's jaw tightened. "I asked some questions. Evelyn said the girl had been unreliable, talked about wanting to leave, Probably just took off one night on impulse. No family filed a missing person report, so there was nothing official to investigate. It got filed under voluntarily relocated, and we all moved on. You think something else happened? I think a pattern is forming, and patterns are data. Frank met his eyes again. Sarah doesn't leave. Doesn't seem to have the option to leave. Lisa left or didn't 25 years ago. That's two women, two similar situations, two outcomes that benefit Evelyn's control over her business. Marcus processed this, fitting pieces together with the kind of tactical assessment that had kept him alive through hostile territory. Has anyone talked to Sarah directly? Asked if she's okay, if she needs help? Small towns have a code. You don't interfere in other people's business unless there's visible evidence of harm. And Evelyn's careful. Sarah doesn't show up with black eyes or broken bones. She shows up every day, does her work, goes home, or wherever she goes when she's not here. Surface level, everything looks like a woman working a job she chose. Frank's expression turned grim. It's what's underneath that your dog is reading, the fear that doesn't need a bruise to be real. Before Marcus could respond, Evelyn appeared at their table. She'd approached from behind keys, silent for once, or maybe Marcus had been too focused on Frank's story to register the warning chime. Frank? Her tone was cordial, but her eyes stayed sharp. Haven't seen you in a while. Thought you'd switch to that new coffee place on Oak Street. Still checking in on old haunts. Frank's demeanor shifted to easy friendliness that looked natural but probably wasn't. Making sure the town's new residents feel welcome. Evelyn's gaze flicked to Marcus. He seems to be managing fine on his own. Just being neighborly. Well, don't let me interrupt. But she didn't move away, just stood there with a presence that was clearly meant to monitor rather than serve. After a beat too long, she addressed Marcus directly. Your dog's still outside. Where else would she be? Just making sure we're all following the health codes. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Wouldn't want any complaints about animals disrupting the dining experience. Through the window, Ash sat perfectly still, the model of obedience. But her eyes tracked Evelyn with the same intensity she'd used to track snipers in Helmand Province. Evelyn finally moved away back toward the kitchen. Frank waited until she was out of earshot before leaning forward slightly. Be careful with this, he said quietly. Whatever you're thinking of doing or investigating or trying to fix. Evelyn's lived here 30 years, has connections, knows how to make people believe her version of events. If you push too hard, too fast, she'll push back, and Sarah will be the one caught in the middle. I'm not planning to push anything, just observing. Observations lead to conclusions. Conclusions lead to actions, and actions in situations like this tend to escalate before they resolve. Frank stood left money for his coffee. But if you do decide to act, do it right. Do it clean. Make sure Sarah has somewhere safe to land before you pull the floor out from under her current reality, however toxic it is. He left through the front door, pausing briefly to nod at Ash through the window. The shepherd's tale moved once acknowledgement between warriors who recognized each other across species and decades. Marcus sat alone with his cooling coffee and watched Sarah work through the morning rush. She moved like water around obstacles, efficient and nearly invisible. When a customer called her over to ask about the daily special, she answered in a voice so quiet Marcus couldn't hear it from 3 tables away. When the customer reached for his wallet, his hand brushed Sarah's arm accidentally. She jerked back before catching herself, smile fixed in place, apologizing for something that wasn't her fault. Evelyn watched it all from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, keys hanging from her belt, like a jailer's reminder. Marcus left before noon, Ash falling into step beside him the moment he cleared the door. They walked back to the motel in silence, the shepherd's attention finally releasing its fixed focus on the diner. When they reached the truck, Marcus found an envelope tucked under the windshield wiper. Plain white, no markings, sealed with a single piece of tape. Inside was a note written in careful cursive on lined paper torn from a small notebook. The handwriting was shaky but legible, formed by someone who'd learned penmanship decades ago and maintained it through whatever had happened since. If you're thinking of helping her, be careful. Debt makes people dangerous. No signature, no indication of who'd written it or when they'd placed it on his truck. Marcus scanned the parking lot, the street beyond the windows of the motel office. Nothing moved. Whoever had delivered this wanted anonymity more than credit. Ash sniffed the envelope, processed whatever chemical signatures the paper carried, then looked up at Marcus with amber eyes that held no answers, just the patient attention of an animal waiting for her handler to decide the next move. He kept the note, folded it carefully, tucked it into his jacket pocket. Frank's warning echoed in his mind, mixing with Ash's consistent alertness and Sarah's careful invisibility and the bruises she hid under long sleeves. Data points forming a pattern that looked increasingly like a prison built without bars, maintained through fear and isolation, and probably things he hadn't identified yet. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. Insomnia wasn't new. 3 years out of uniform hadn't cured the habit of waking at 0:30, ready for threats that no longer existed, but usually he could read or walk until exhaustion won. Tonight his mind kept circling back to the diner, to Sarah's flinch, to Evelyn's keys, to Frank's story about Lisa, who'd left without leaving. At 2300 hours, he gave up, pretending rest would come. Ash was already awake, watching him from her bed near the door. She didn't need the invitation to follow when he grabbed his jacket and headed out. The town was dead quiet at this hour, winter silence amplified by the kind of cold that made sound carry strange and distance feel compressed. Marcus drove rather than walked, partly because the temperature had dropped into single digits, mostly because he wanted the option of fast movement if something went sideways. The diner sat dark on its corner windows, black parking lot empty. But as Marcus slowed the truck to a crawl past the building, Ash's body went rigid in the passenger seat. Not the alert attention she'd maintained during the day, but combat-level threat response. Her hackles rose fully, ears pinned back, teeth bared in a snarl that vibrated through her entire frame. Marcus killed the headlights, coasted to a stop half a block past the diner. Through the rearview mirror he could see the building's back section. A door there hung slightly open, spilling weak yellow light across the alley. Interior light, basement level based on the angle. He parked, grabbed the mag light from the glove box, clipped Ash's leash, even though he knew she'd stay at his heel without it. Military training didn't fade. Together they moved back toward the diner, staying in shadow boots, silent on frozen ground. The alley smelled wrong. Same chemical signature he'd noticed that first morning, but concentrated now. Sharp. Medical almost, but not quite. Something organic underneath the chemistry. The basement door stood open, 6 inches interior light, cutting a narrow wedge into the darkness. Ash pulled toward it, nose working overtime, processing information Marcus's inferior human senses couldn't capture. He let her lead, trusting her read of the situation. From inside came sounds, movement, something being dragged across concrete, a voice muffled and indistinct but carrying the cadence of command. Then silence. Then the sound of liquid pouring glass on glass. Ash's growl started deep, a subsonic warning that Marcus felt more than heard. He put a hand on her shoulder, steadying rather than restraining. Whatever was happening down there, going in blind would help no one. Better to document, to gather evidence, to build a case that could stand daylight scrutiny rather than just late-night suspicion. They stayed in the alley for 10 minutes. Footsteps eventually climbed stairs inside, grew fainter. The light in the basement flickered once, twice, then steadied. A door closed somewhere deeper in the building. Then nothing. Just winter night, and the smell of chemicals, and Ash's continued alertness that confirmed Marcus's growing certainty that something profoundly wrong was being maintained in that basement. He pulled the shepherd back, retreated to the truck. She went reluctantly, kept looking over her shoulder toward the diner like she was leaving a position before the mission was complete. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the diner at his usual time. Sarah was already working, moving between tables with that same careful efficiency. But something was different. She looked worse. Skin paler, dark circles under her eyes, hands trembling slightly when she poured coffee. When she reached up to grab something from a high shelf, her sleeve pulled back enough to show fresh bruising on her wrist. Dark purple, hours old at most, finger-shaped marks that told a story about grip and pressure and pain inflicted by someone who knew how much force to use without breaking bone. She caught Marcus looking, pulled the sleeve down, immediately turned away to busy herself with a task that didn't exist. Evelyn emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of pastries. She set them in the display case with movements that seemed normal, casual, utterly at odds with what Marcus had seen, or rather hadn't quite seen, but knew had happened in the basement the night before. He waited until Sarah came by his table to refill his coffee. When she reached for his cup, he spoke quietly, pitched for her ears only. "You okay?" Her hand jerked, coffee slopping slightly. She grabbed a napkin, wiped. The spill didn't make eye contact. "I'm fine. Your wrist says different." She went very still. Then, barely above a whisper, words that came out too fast, like they'd been building pressure. "Please don't say anything, don't do anything, it'll just make it worse." Before Marcus could respond, Evelyn's voice cut across the diner. "Sarah Kitchen needs you." Sarah moved immediately, the kind of instant obedience that came from muscle memory and fear of consequences. She disappeared through the swinging door, leaving Marcus alone with his coffee and the growing certainty that observation time was over. Whatever was happening here required intervention, but Frank had been right. Doing it wrong would hurt Sarah more than help her. That afternoon, Marcus found Frank at the town's small library reading a newspaper in the periodicals section. The older man looked up when Marcus slid into the chair across from him, registered something in his expression, and set the paper aside. "You found something?" "Questions, mostly, but they're the kind that need answers." Marcus kept his voice low. The library was nearly empty, but sound carried in quiet spaces. "You mentioned Lisa Brennan. What else do you remember about her disappearance?" Frank's expression tightened. "Not much more than I already told you. She was maybe 28, worked at the diner for 2 or 3 years. Quiet girl, kept to herself, didn't cause problems. One day she wasn't there anymore. Evelyn said she'd left. No one pushed hard on that explanation." "But you had doubts." "I had questions. They're not the same thing." Frank glanced around the library, confirming their privacy. "I tried to find her, put out some inquiries through channels. Never got a response. Eventually I had to accept she'd either truly left on her own or something had happened that was beyond my ability to investigate without official cause." "What if I could find her?" Marcus leaned forward slightly. "What if she's still alive, still out there, and willing to talk about why she really left?" Frank's eyes sharpened. "That would change things. But finding someone who disappeared 25 years ago without a trail isn't easy, even with resources." "I've got resources, and I've got time." Marcus paused. "What I need is confirmation that I'm not chasing ghosts, that there's a real pattern here, not just my imagination connecting dots that don't actually line up." The older man studied him for a long moment, measuring something that probably went beyond just this conversation. Finally, he nodded. "I kept the file. Unofficial, not logged anywhere, just my own notes and copies of records I pulled before I retired. It's not much, but it's something." He stood, joints creaking slightly. "Come by my place tonight, 7 o'clock. I'll show you what I have." Frank Hollis lived in a 2-story craftsman on the edge of town, where the street gave way to pine forest, and the nearest neighbor was far enough that privacy was guaranteed by distance rather than courtesy. The house showed signs of maintenance deferred not from neglect, but from the calculated decisions of a man living alone who fixed what broke and ignored what merely aged. Paint peeled near the gutters. The porch steps sagged slightly in the middle, but the windows were clean and the walkway clear of snow, suggesting someone who still cared about functionality, even if aesthetics had stopped mattering years ago. Marcus arrived at 1900 hours with Ash at his heel. The shepherd's posture had shifted from the rigid alertness she maintained near the diner to something closer to normal patrol stance. Whatever threats existed here were different in nature, possibly non-existent. Frank opened the door before Marcus could knock, ushered them inside to warmth that smelled like old wood and coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. The interior matched the exterior's functional philosophy, furniture that had survived decades through durability rather than style. Bookshelves crammed with paperbacks and reference volumes organized by some system that probably made sense to Frank and no one else. A desk in the corner buried under file folders and yellow legal pads covered in handwriting that looked like it had been practiced during an era when penmanship classes were mandatory. He gestured Marcus toward the couch, disappeared into what was probably a study or spare bedroom, returned carrying a banker's box that raised dust when he set it on the coffee table between them. "Everything I kept from my time on the force. Officially, I was supposed to turn it all in when I retired, but some cases deserved better than getting filed in a basement where no one would ever look at them again." Frank's hands rested on the box lid, not opening it yet. "Lisa Brennan is in here. So are 3 other women who went missing from this region over a 30-year period. Different circumstances, different timelines, but all of them had one thing in common. They were alone, vulnerable, and nobody pushed hard to find them when they disappeared." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. "You think Evelyn was involved in all of them?" "I think Evelyn owns the only establishment in town that consistently hires women with nowhere else to go. I think she's run that diner for 35 years with a pattern of employees who arrive desperate and leave suddenly or don't leave at all." Frank opened the box, pulled out a file folder worn soft at the edges from handling. "Lisa's the only one I can connect directly to the diner. The others worked different places, had different stories. But the profile matches. Young women, early 20s to mid-30s, no strong family connections, often running from something. They come to towns like this looking for fresh starts and find people willing to exploit that desperation." He handed Marcus the folder. Inside were photocopied police reports, handwritten notes, a few photographs that looked like they'd been taken from a driver's license or employee badge. Lisa Brennan stared out from one of them with dark eyes and a half-smile that didn't quite reach the rest of her face. 28 years old, according to the date stamp. though she could have passed for younger or older, depending on the light and what she'd survived before the camera captured her. The reports were thin. Initial missing person filed by a landlord who'd found her room abandoned with personal effects still inside. Interview with Evelyn stating Lisa had quit without notice, seemed unstable, talked about leaving town. Follow-up interviews with a handful of townspeople who'd known Lisa casually but couldn't offer information beyond confirming she'd worked at the diner and kept mostly to herself. Case marked inactive after 6 months when no new leads emerged and no body turned up. Marcus flipped through the pages, absorbing details. The landlord said she left her stuff behind. What kind of stuff? Clothes mostly, toiletries, a few books. Nothing valuable but the kind of things people don't usually abandon if they're planning a deliberate departure. Frank pulled another sheet from deeper in the folder. This is the inventory the landlord provided. I went through it with him personally, made notes about anything that seemed significant. The list was mundane in its specificity. 3 pairs of jeans, 5 t-shirts, 2 sweaters, a winter coat, hairbrush, toothbrush. A paperback copy of something by Stephen King bookmark, still wedged at page 237. The accumulated detritus of a life interrupted mid-sentence. She didn't plan to leave. Marcus set the inventory aside. People who plan departures pack their coats. It was November when she disappeared. That's what bothered me then. Still bothers me now. Frank settled back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. I pushed for a more thorough investigation. Wanted to search the diner, question Evelyn more aggressively. My captain shut it down. Said we didn't have probable cause, that voluntary departure by an adult with no dependents wasn't a priority when we had actual crimes to investigate. So you kept digging on your own. For about a year. Then I hit walls everywhere I turned. Lisa didn't have credit cards we could track. No cell phone in those days for most people. Her family, what little existed, hadn't heard from her in years before she came to town. So her silence after didn't register as unusual to them. Trail went cold and stayed cold. Frank's jaw worked sideways, frustration bleeding through decades of professional detachment. I've always wondered if I'd pushed harder, done something different, whether she'd still be alive, or if she is alive somewhere and I just failed to find her. Marcus studied the photograph again. Lisa's eyes held something he recognized from combat zones, the look of someone who'd learned to expect the worst and been proven right often enough that hope had become a liability rather than comfort. I might be able to find her. The words came out before Marcus had fully processed the decision, but once spoken, they felt right. I know people networks methods that weren't available 25 years ago. If Lisa Brennan is alive somewhere, there'll be traces. Social security numbers get used, addresses get recorded, employment leaves, paper trails, even when people try to disappear. Frank's expression shifted through several configurations before settling on something that might have been hope-tempered by experience. And if you find her, what then? Then we ask her what really happened, why she left, whether it was voluntary or something else. Marcus paused, weighing how much to share about his growing certainty that Sarah was trapped in the same mechanism that had caught Lisa. And we use that information to help someone who might need the same escape route but doesn't know how to access it. Understanding dawned across Frank's weathered features. Sarah. Sarah. The older man nodded, slowly pulled another folder from the box. This one was thinner, more recently assembled based on the crisp edges and unstained manila. Started keeping notice on Sarah about 6 months ago. Nothing official, just observation from someone who remembers patterns and doesn't like the way this one is repeating itself. He opened the folder, revealed photographs taken from a distance with telephoto lens. Sarah entering the diner before dawn. Sarah leaving long after dark. Sarah with groceries, with library books, walking alone through town with that careful posture that suggested someone always monitoring for threats. She lives in a room above the diner, has for 15 years, pays rent directly to Evelyn through payroll deduction. Never seems to have money for anything beyond bare necessities, doesn't own a car, doesn't take vacations, doesn't appear to have friends beyond casual acquaintance with library staff and maybe 1 or 2 regulars at the diner. Marcus examined the photographs with the clinical attention he'd once applied to surveillance targets. How much does Evelyn pay her? Can't confirm exact amounts, but based on hours worked and what comparable positions earn around here, she should be making around $30,000 a year. Maybe a bit more with tips, though. I don't think Evelyn lets her keep those. Frank shuffled through papers, found a calculation sheet covered in neat columns. Rent for a room above a commercial building in this town runs maybe $300 a month. Food and basic living expenses another $200. That leaves approximately $2,500 a month that should be accumulating somewhere. Sarah doesn't have a bank account. I checked with the 3 banks in a 50-mile radius. She doesn't have investments, doesn't own property. So where's the money going? Evelyn claims Sarah owes her, not officially on any books but verbally. Story is that Sarah couldn't handle the business after her parents died, was about to lose everything, and Evelyn stepped in to save the diner. In return, Sarah agreed to work off the debt. Frank's mouth twisted around the words like they tasted wrong. Except there's no contract, no formal agreement, no legal structure that would make such a debt binding. It's all verbal, all based on Sarah's acceptance of the narrative that she owes Evelyn her survival. Marcus felt pieces clicking together with the weight of certainty. Evelyn didn't save Sarah, she trapped her. That's my assessment. But assessment isn't evidence, and without Sarah willing to testify that she's being held against her will, there's nothing law enforcement can do. She's an adult. She works voluntarily as far as anyone can prove. The fact that her volunteerism is coerced through psychological manipulation and possibly other means doesn't change how it looks from the outside. Frank closed the folder, met Marcus's eyes with an expression that carried 30 years of cases that ended wrong. Which is why, if you're going to do something about this, you need to do it carefully. You need evidence that will stand up to scrutiny. And you need Sarah to be willing to leave, because forcing her out of this situation against her will just trade one form of control for another. They talked for another hour, mapping possibilities and obstacles. Frank provided contact information for the landlord who'd filed the original missing person report on Lisa, still alive, still living in town, still maintaining that something about the whole situation had never sat right. He gave Marcus copies of everything in the file, including notes he'd never put in official reports because they were hunches rather than facts. At the diner at 07:30 earlier. At the diner at 07:30 earlier than his usual routine, early enough that the morning rush hadn't started, and Sarah was working alone while Evelyn handled something in the kitchen. Ash assumed her position outside, body language immediately shifting to alert status as proximity to the building engaged whatever threat assessment ran constantly in her military-trained mind. Sarah looked worse than she had the previous day. The bruises on her wrist had darkened overnight, purple spreading to yellow at the edges in the timeline of tissue damage. But beyond the physical marks, something else had deteriorated. Her movements carried a tremor that went beyond simple fatigue. When she poured coffee, liquid sloshed against the rim of cups she'd handled thousands of times without issue. Her eyes had the unfocused quality that came from either profound exhaustion or chemical interference. Marcus ordered breakfast, watched her write down the ticket with letters that wavered across the page. When she turned to take it to the kitchen, she stumbled slightly, caught herself against the counter, stood very still for a moment, as if waiting for the world to stabilize around her. Evelyn emerged carrying plates for another table. Her gaze swept across Sarah with the kind of clinical assessment that suggested monitoring rather than concern. "You feeling all right?" The question sounded casual, almost maternal, but something underneath contradicted the surface tone. "Morning prep. Go have some before you fall, morning prep. Go have some before you fall over." Sarah hesitated, clearly wanting to refuse, equally clearly not believing she had that option. She disappeared into the kitchen while Evelyn took over her section, refilling coffee and clearing tables with practiced efficiency. 5 minutes later, Sarah returned with a bowl of oatmeal and what looked like orange juice. She sat at the far end of the counter, the only staff member Marcus had ever seen eating during business hours, and began spooning up small bites that she chewed mechanically. Through the window, Ash went rigid. Not the gradual tension of building awareness, but instant threat recognition. Her hackles rose in a ridge along her spine. The growl that emerged was low and continuous, not aggressive warning, but something closer to alarm. Marcus watched Sarah lift another spoonful, watched her pause as if some instinct warned her to reconsider, watched her override that instinct and swallow anyway, because questioning food at this point was probably beyond her capacity for resistance. Ash barked, once sharp and commanding, the sound she'd used in Afghanistan when Marcus was about to step on buried explosives. Every head in the diner turned toward the window. Sarah's spoon clattered against the bowl rim. Marcus was already moving out the door in 3 strides, Ash immediately at his side. She pulled him back toward the diner, not to the main entrance, but around to the window where she could see Sarah more directly. Her nose pressed against the glass, breath fogging. The growl intensified. He went back inside. Evelyn was telling another customer something about dogs that weren't properly trained. Sarah had set her spoon down and was staring at the bowl like it might contain answers to questions she couldn't articulate. Marcus approached the counter, addressed Sarah directly. "Don't eat that." She looked up, confusion and fear competing for dominance across her features. "What?" "The oatmeal. Don't eat any more of it." He kept his voice level calm, the tone that got people to comply in crisis situations without triggering panic. "Please." Evelyn materialized beside him, every line of her body radiating controlled anger. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting my dog has training that makes her very good at detecting things that don't belong in food." Marcus didn't look at Evelyn, kept his attention on Sarah. "And right now she's telling me there's something wrong with what you're eating." Sarah's hand moved to cover her stomach, protective gesture that was probably unconscious. I don't... You don't have to eat it." Marcus reached for the bowl, but Evelyn's hand got there first, closing around the rim with enough force that her knuckles went white. "This is harassment. Your dog is disrupting my business, and now you're making unfounded accusations about food safety." Her voice had ice underneath it, the kind that came from knowing exactly what she'd done and betting no one could prove it. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Permanently." "That's fine. But I'm taking the bowl with me." "Like hell you are." Marcus met her eyes fully for the first time, let her see whatever expression had convinced Taliban fighters to surrender rather than test whether he was bluffing. "I'm taking the bowl. You can call the police, file a complaint, do whatever you need to do. But that food is leaving this building with me, and it's going to be tested. If there's nothing wrong with it, you'll get an apology. If there is, we'll have a very different conversation." The standoff held for 5 seconds that felt considerably longer. Other customers had stopped pretending not to watch. Sarah sat frozen between them, comprehension slowly dawning across features that suggested she'd suspected something like this, but never had confirmation. Evelyn released the bowl. "Get out, both of you, and don't come back." Marcus took the bowl, and the glass of juice cradled them carefully. Sarah stood swayed slightly, caught herself. "Come with me." He made it a request rather than command. "Let me get you somewhere safe. Get you checked out by a doctor." Sarah's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Finally, words emerged, barely audible. "I can't. If I leave, it'll be worse. She'll..." The sentence died unfinished, but the fear that killed it was explicit enough. "She won't be able to do anything if you're not here." "You don't understand. There's nowhere to go. No money, no car, no family. She's right, I owe her everything." Marcus wanted to argue to dismantle the logic that kept her chained to this place, but Frank's warning echoed, forcing her out, just traded one control for another. Sarah had to choose to leave, had to believe leaving was possible, and right now that belief didn't exist in her reality. "Okay." He stepped back, gave her space. "But if you change your mind, you know where to find me. The Pineview Motel, room 7. He left with the bowl and glass sealed in plastic bags he'd grabbed from behind the counter over Evelyn's protests. Ash stayed at his heel until they cleared the building, then relaxed incrementally as distance grew. The pharmacist Marcus knew from his first week in town, a former Army medic who'd recognized the signs of someone carrying combat scars and offered professional courtesy without prying, agreed to test the samples off-record. It took 6 hours. Marcus spent them at the motel with Ash, both of them wound tight with the waiting that had nothing to do with patience and everything to do with confirming suspicions that would require action once verified. The call came at 1500 hours. "You were right to be suspicious." The pharmacist's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news they'd rather not own. "The oatmeal tested positive for benzodiazepines, specifically alprazolam. Dosage is hard to determine from what you brought me, but based on the concentration I'm seeing, I'd estimate between 2 and 3 milligrams mixed into approximately 1 cup of oatmeal." Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. "What would that do to someone who ate it regularly?" "Depends on tolerance and body weight, but generally you'd see sedation-impaired cognitive function, physical dependence developing over time. If someone's been ingesting this daily for months or years, and I'm guessing that's what you're asking about, they'd experience chronic fatigue anxiety when the drug wears off, difficulty making decisions or thinking clearly. It would effectively create a state of chemical docility." "Could it be accidental contamination from legitimate prescription medication?" "Not at this concentration. This is deliberate dosing. Someone calculated how much to use to achieve effects without causing obvious overdose symptoms." A pause then. "Marcus, if someone is being drugged without their knowledge or consent, that's a serious crime. You need to involve law enforcement." "Working on it. Thanks for the analysis." He hung up before the conversation could drift toward advice he wasn't ready to take yet. Evidence was one thing. Evidence that would hold up in court while protecting Sarah from retaliation was something else entirely. That night, Marcus couldn't settle. The motel room felt too small, air too stale, his mind circling through scenarios that all ended in Sarah trapped because no one could build a case fast enough to extract her before Evelyn escalated. He tried reading, tried watching whatever local news the TV could pull from the air, finally gave up and reached for his boots. Ash was already at the door waiting. She knew the pattern of insomnia-driven walks had accompanied him through enough sleepless nights that his restlessness cued her readiness without need for command. They drove past the diner at 2200 hours. The building sat dark and silent, no lights visible from the street. But as Marcus slowed the truck, preparing to continue past, his phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. He almost didn't answer, reflexively distrustful of unexpected contact, but something made him accept the call. Breathing on the other end. Rough, uneven, the sound of someone crying or trying not to. Then a voice he recognized, despite its distortion through tears and fear. "She knows you took the food. She's so angry. I've never seen her this angry." Sarah's words tumbled over each other, panic bleeding through every syllable. "She said I'm ungrateful, that I've been conspiring against her, that I need to remember who saved me. She gave me pills, said they'd help me calm down, but I don't feel—" The phone clattered. Marcus heard it hit something hard, heard Sarah's breathing accelerate into hyperventilation territory, heard another voice in the background shouting words he couldn't distinguish but didn't need to understand to recognize as threats. "Sarah." He was already turning the truck around, accelerating back toward the diner. "Sarah, where are you?" No response. The connection stayed open but transmitted only sounds of struggle, furniture scraping across floor, something glass breaking, Sarah's voice rising into a cry that got cut off mid-note. Then silence. Then the dial tone. Marcus covered the 6 blocks to the diner in less than 2 minutes, parking rules and traffic signals irrelevant against the sounds still echoing from the phone. The building remained dark from the street view, but when he and Ash circled to the back alley, weak light spilled from the basement door, hanging open exactly like it had the night he'd first observed it. He didn't hesitate this time. Didn't pause to gather evidence or consider consequences. The door splintered inward under his bootwood that had survived decades, giving up its structural integrity in one kick. Ash didn't wait for permission, slipping through the opening ahead of him, nose low and searching. The basement smelled like chemicals and old concrete and something organic that suggested fear had a scent humans could detect when it reached sufficient concentration. Stairs descended into yellow light that came from a single bulb hanging from exposed ceiling beams. Sarah's voice filtered up, weak and pleading. "Please, I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to—" Evelyn's response was cold enough to carry despite the words being indistinct. The tone alone communicated everything Marcus needed to know about what was happening down there. He took the stairs 3 at a time, Ash already ahead of him, and growling with an intensity that meant imminent threat. The basement opened into a space that had been finished at some point. Drywall painted institutional beige fluorescent fixtures augmenting the single bulb, and in the far corner near an old washing machine, Sarah crumpled against the wall with a pill bottle rolled from her hand, and Evelyn standing over her with a knife that looked small until you factored in how much damage even small blades inflicted when wielded with intent. Ash hit Evelyn at hip level, 70 pounds of trained aggression channeled into controlled violence that stopped short of lethal but communicated capability. The knife clattered across concrete. Marcus was past Ash, dropping to his knees beside Sarah, checking pulse that was there but thready breathing that came shallow and irregular. The pill bottle was half empty. The label read alprazolam prescription in Evelyn's name, but the dosage information suggested Sarah had ingested at least 3 times the recommended amount in however long had passed since the phone call ended. Behind him, Evelyn was screaming. Coherent words dissolved into raw fury, the sound of someone watching carefully constructed control mechanisms collapse in real time. Ash kept her pinned without biting, without escalating, just holding position with the steady attention that had kept Marcus alive through ambushes and firefights. Sarah's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and struggling. Her lips moved around words that didn't quite form, but the intent was clear enough. Help. Please. Some variation of the desperation that had probably lived inside her for 15 years without outlet. Marcus gathered her into his arms, lighter than she should be despite being 39 years old and not particularly small in frame. Starvation came in forms beyond just withheld food. Her head lolled against his shoulder, brown hair falling across a face that might have held beauty once before terror became the permanent setting. "This isn't over." Evelyn's voice followed him up the stairs, brittle with the kind of rage that came from losing property rather than concern for a person. "You hear me? This isn't—" The night swallowed the rest. Marcus kicked through the front door rather than bothering with locks, Sarah cradled against his chest, Ash falling into formation beside him. The truck was 15 feet away. The emergency clinic was 4 minutes if he ignored speed limits and stop signs. Sarah's breathing stayed shallow but steady enough that he could take those 4 minutes without watching her die in transit. Ash jumped into the passenger seat, looked back at their cargo, then forward through the windshield with amber eyes that had cataloged the threat and moved on to scanning for new ones. The clinic was a small operation, barely more than an urgent care facility, but it was staffed 24 hours, and the doctor on duty had treated enough overdoses to recognize one on site. She took Sarah from Marcus's arms without questions beyond the essential ones: what substance, approximate amount, time of ingestion. Benzodiazepines, probably 6 to 9 milligrams based on the bottle count within the last hour. Marcus provided information with clinical precision while Sarah was transferred to a gurney and wheeled toward an examination room. She was conscious when I found her responsive to verbal stimuli but disoriented. The doctor nodded, already moving, calling for flumazanil and starting protocols Marcus recognized from field medicine training. "You're not family." "No, but she doesn't have family. And the person who gave her the pills is the same person who's been drugging her food for what I'm guessing is years." That earned a sharp look. "We'll need to call the police." "Do it. And when you do, tell them to send someone to arrest Evelyn Morse for assault, attempted murder, and whatever else applies to systematically poisoning someone without their consent." He paused at the examination room door, watching Sarah's pale face disappear behind medical personnel. "I'll be in the waiting room. I've got evidence that needs to be documented before it disappears." The next 3 hours passed in the specific kind of purgatory that came from waiting for outcomes beyond your control. Marcus gave his statement to a sheriff's deputy who looked young enough to still be working through academy habits, wrote down everything from the first morning Ash stopped at the diner through tonight's forced ingestion. The deputy took notes with the careful attention of someone who understood this was going to be a complicated case, requiring documentation that would survive legal scrutiny. Evelyn was arrested at 0200 hours. The deputy's partner called from the scene, reported that she'd tried to flee, had been found in her car with a suitcase containing cash and what looked like 20 years of meticulously kept records documenting Sarah's debt down to the penny. Records that probably seemed like evidence of legitimate business to Evelyn and would read as detailed confession to anyone examining them with fresh eyes. Sarah regained consciousness at 0330. The doctor emerged to report that she'd stabilized, that the flumazanil had counteracted the worst of the benzodiazepine effects, that she'd need monitoring for another 6 hours minimum, but prognosis was good for full physical recovery. The psychological recovery is a different question. The doctor kept her voice low, professional distance slipping enough to show the concern underneath. "She's been asking for you. Says she doesn't know who else to talk to, doesn't trust anyone else. I've explained she doesn't have to talk to anyone right now, but she insists." Marcus followed her back to the examination room where Sarah lay propped on pillows that looked too white against her pallor. Someone had changed her into a hospital gown. Started an IV, attached monitors that beeped softly in rhythms that suggested stability, if not quite health. Her eyes tracked him when he entered, following his movement to the chair beside the bed with attention that suggested the drugs were clearing enough for focus to return. "Ash." Her voice came out rough, probably from crying or screaming or both. "She's in the truck. They don't allow dogs in here except service animals, and I didn't want to push the technicality when they were saving your life." A ghost of a smile touched her mouth and vanished. "She knew. Before I knew. Before anyone knew. She's good at detecting threats. It's what she was trained to do." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing or gathering strength, or maybe just acknowledging that conversation required energy she wasn't sure she possessed. When she spoke again, her words came slow and deliberate, like each one required conscious selection. "I came here 15 years ago, ran from a husband who put me in the hospital twice and promised the third time would be permanent. I had nothing, no money, no education beyond high school, no family after my parents died. I thought I was going to die in some ditch somewhere cold and alone." Her fingers picked at the blanket covering her legs, nervous motion that suggested this story had never been told out loud before. "Evelyn found me outside the diner. I'd collapsed from hunger and exhaustion. She brought me inside, fed me, let me sleep in a storage room, told me I could work for her, earn my keep, build a new life. That's not what happened. That's exactly what happened for about 6 months. Then she started keeping track of how much food I ate, how much the room cost, what it took to keep me alive. Started presenting it as debt I owed her. Started saying I'd never be able to pay it back, but she'd let me work it off anyway because she was kind." Sarah's eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall like her body had decided crying was a waste of resources she couldn't spare. By the end of the first year, I owed her $30,000 according to her books. By year 5, it was over $100,000. The numbers stopped meaning anything except proof that I could never leave. Marcus let the silence hold, gave her space to continue or stop as needed. She started giving me vitamins around year 7. Said I looked run down, needed supplements to keep my strength up for the work. I trusted her. She'd saved me, kept me alive, given me purpose. Why wouldn't I trust her? The bitterness in those words could have stripped paint. I started feeling tired all the time. Couldn't think straight. Couldn't remember things. Couldn't imagine any future beyond the diner and the debt, and Evelyn's voice telling me what to do next. The vitamins were alprazolam. I know that now. Didn't know it for 8 years. Just thought I was weak, broken, incapable of being anything except what she told me I was. Sarah finally looked directly at Marcus' eyes, carrying the weight of decade-plus realization. You asked me yesterday if I was okay. I said yes because I didn't know what not okay looked like anymore. This became normal. Fear became baseline. Debt became identity. You don't owe her anything. You never did. My brain knows that now. The rest of me is going to take longer to believe it. She paused, breath catching. There was another girl, before me. Lisa. I only worked with her for a few months before she disappeared. Evelyn said she'd run off, stolen money, proved herself ungrateful for everything Evelyn had done. I believed that too. Believed it meant I had to work harder, prove I wasn't like Lisa. Marcus felt pieces clicking into position with the weight of dread that came from patterns completing themselves. What if Lisa didn't run off? What if she escaped? Sarah's expression shifted, moving through possibilities she'd never been allowed to consider. You think Evelyn did this to her too? I think Evelyn has a pattern. I think you're not the first, and if she'd succeeded tonight, you wouldn't have been the last. He leaned forward, keeping his voice gentle. The police are going to want to talk to you. They're going to need your statement about what happened tonight and what's been happening for 15 years. You don't have to do it right now, but eventually you're going to have to decide whether you want to help build a case that makes sure Evelyn can't do this to anyone else. Fear flickered across Sarah's face, muscle memory of 15 years being told that speaking against Evelyn would result in consequences too terrible to name. But underneath the fear, something else was growing. Not quite anger yet, not quite resolve, but maybe the seed of both. I'll talk to them. The words were quiet but carried commitment. I'll tell them everything. All of it. Every day she made me doubt myself, every time she adjusted the debt to make sure I could never pay it, every vitamin she made me swallow while telling me it was for my own good. She pulled in a shaking breath. But I need to know what happens to me after. Where do I go? How do I live when I don't know how to live without someone telling me what to do next? That was the question Marcus had been dreading, the one that didn't have easy answers. Frank had been right. Extraction without destination just created new problems. Sarah had spent 15 years being controlled so thoroughly that autonomy felt like freefall rather than freedom. One step at a time. It was inadequate, he knew that even as he said it. First you heal, then we figure out next steps together. You're not alone in this anymore. Sarah's eyes closed, exhaustion finally overwhelming whatever adrenaline had kept her conscious through the conversation. Marcus sat with her until her breathing evened into sleep, then stepped out to find the deputy still waiting for his formal statement. The sun was rising when Marcus finally made it back to his truck. Ash greeted him with the kind of restraint that suggested she'd been worried but knew celebration was premature. They drove back to the motel through streets painted gold with early light, the town beginning to wake without knowledge that one of its long-standing businesses had just collapsed under the weight of crimes that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Frank called it 0800 hours. He'd heard through whatever networks retired cops maintained about the arrest, wanted confirmation of details and assessment of what came next. Sarah's going to testify. Marcus kept his voice low despite being alone in the motel room. She's scared, traumatized, not sure how to function outside of Evelyn's control, but she's willing to put it all on record. That's good. That's more than I had with Lisa. Frank paused. You still planning to look for her? More than ever. If Evelyn did this to Sarah for 15 years, I want to know what she did to Lisa 25 years ago. And I want Lisa to know that what happened to her mattered, that someone finally paid attention. I'll send you everything I have. Contact information for Lisa's old landlord, the few people who knew her employment records if I can dig them up. It's not much, but it's a starting point. Marcus thanked him, ended the call, and pulled out the laptop he'd bought at the electronics store 2 towns over. Finding someone who'd disappeared deliberately 25 years ago required tools and resources most people didn't have access to. but 3 years of contract work after leaving the military had connected Marcus with networks that existed specifically to find people who didn't want to be found. He started with the basics. Lisa Brennan. Last known location. This town disappeared, November 1999. No credit history after that date, no employment records in the U.S., no property ownership or tax filings, which meant either she was dead or she'd done exactly what someone would do if they were running from something, crossed a border, established new identity, started over somewhere. Documentation requirements were loose enough to allow reinvention. Canada was the obvious choice. Close, accessible, willing to accept Americans who showed up with cash and determination. Marcus sent queries to contacts who specialized in tracking movements across the northern border, specifically looking for women matching Lisa's description who might have established residency in the early 2000s. The response came back faster than expected. 3 possible matches in British Columbia alone, another 2 in Alberta. All of them women approximately the right age who'd appeared in Canadian systems around the relevant time frame without clear documentation of prior history. Marcus started making calls. The first 3 went nowhere. Wrong people willing to confirm but clearly not Lisa, based on details that didn't match. The 4th call connected him to a woman in Vancouver who went silent when he mentioned the diner in the northern U.S. Town stayed silent long enough that he thought the connection had dropped. Then, who's asking? Someone trying to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to someone else, or has already stopped happening to her. Marcus kept his tone even non-threatening. My name is Marcus Brennan. I'm not law enforcement, not a journalist, just someone who noticed a pattern that needs to be broken. Another long pause. Is she still there, Evelyn? She was. She's in custody now. Arrested last night for drugging and attempting to force an overdose on a woman who's been working for her for 15 years. He heard breath catch on the other end of the line. A woman named Sarah Mitchell, who I think went through exactly what you went through, except she didn't get out. Until now. The silence this time carried different weight. Processing, maybe. Or deciding whether engaging was worth the risk of dredging up trauma that had probably taken years to bury. Finally, I'll talk to you, but not over the phone, and not in person. I don't ever want to be in the same state as that woman again, custody or not. A pause. Video call. Tomorrow 10 a.m. Pacific time. I'll send you a link. The call ended before Marcus could confirm or negotiate. He marked the time, sent a text to the number she'd called from confirming he'd be available. 26 hours until he could ask Lisa Brennan what had really happened in that diner and whether her escape was the blueprint that could help Sarah build something beyond survival. The video call connected at precisely 10 a.m. Pacific, which meant Marcus had been awake for 36 hours straight and running on coffee that tasted like regret. His laptop screen flickered once, twice, then resolved into the image of a woman sitting in what looked like a small apartment with white walls and minimal decoration. Lisa Brennan, at 53, carried her years differently than Sarah carried 39. Where Sarah's face held the erosion of sustained fear, Lisa's showed the harder edges of someone who'd survived by learning to trust nothing and no one. Her hair was dark cut short in a style that suggested practicality over aesthetics. She wore a gray sweater that blended into the background camouflage of a different sort. Her eyes were the same ones from the photograph Frank had shown Marcus, but sharper now, honed by whatever the intervening decades had taught her about reading threats before they materialized. You're the one who called. Not a question, just establishing parameters. Her voice carried a faint accent that might have been Canadian or might have been the result of 25 years away from American speech patterns. Marcus Brennan, thank you for agreeing to talk. I didn't agree to anything yet except this call. Whether I talk depends on what you want and why it matters. She leaned back slightly, creating distance even through digital connection. You said Evelyn was arrested. For what specifically? Drugging Sarah Mitchell with benzodiazepines for approximately 8 years, attempting to force an overdose when Sarah tried to resist, and what's looking like a pattern of labor trafficking through debt bondage. Marcus kept his delivery clinical facts without embellishment. Sarah's in the hospital recovering, Evelyn's in custody awaiting arraignment, and I'm trying to build a case that makes sure this pattern stops permanently. Lisa's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. Sarah's the one who replaced me. She arrived about 15 years ago. Does that timeline match when you left? I didn't leave. I escaped. There's a difference. Lisa's jaw tightened, old anger bleeding through controlled presentation. Evelyn had me for 3 years. Same pattern found me when I was desperate, offered help, slowly converted assistance into debt, used that debt to justify complete control over my life. By the end, I was working 16-hour days, living in a room barely bigger than a closet, eating whatever scraps she deemed appropriate, and being told constantly that I owed her everything, including my continued existence. Marcus pulled out the notebook he'd been using to document the case, pen ready. Did she drug you? I don't know. Probably. I was exhausted all the time, couldn't think straight, had trouble making even basic decisions. I thought it was just the work and the stress and my own inadequacy. Lisa's mouth twisted around the last word like it still carried poison. She was very good at making everything feel like my fault. My weakness, my failure, my inability to repay the kindness she'd shown me. How did you get out? The question hung in the digital space between them. Lisa's gaze shifted slightly, focusing on something beyond the camera, maybe memory or maybe just the wall behind Marcus's screen image. I got lucky. A truck driver came in for coffee one morning, overheard Evelyn screaming at me about something trivial. After she went into the kitchen, he slipped me his card and told me if I ever needed a ride away from there, no questions asked, he ran routes through town every Tuesday. Her voice flattened, relaying information stripped of the emotion that probably accompanied the actual events. It took me 4 months to work up the courage to use it. 4 months of carrying that card hidden in my shoe, terrified Evelyn would find it, terrified of what would happen if I tried to leave and failed. But you did leave. On a Tuesday in November, Evelyn sent me to the store for supplies. I had maybe 20 minutes before she'd expect me back. The driver was at the gas station like he'd promised. I got in his truck with nothing except the clothes I was wearing and the cash I'd managed to steal from the register over the previous weeks, about $300 total. Lisa's hands moved, fingers interlacing and releasing in patterns that suggested this story didn't get easier with retelling. He drove me to the Canadian border, dropped me at a crossing station where I could walk through on foot. I told the border agent I was visiting friends in Vancouver, had my stolen cash, and a fake story about where I was staying. They let me through. And you never came back. Never even considered it. Changed my name legally once I'd been in Canada long enough to establish residency. Built a new life from nothing, which turned out to be easier than trying to reclaim the old one Evelyn had destroyed. She paused, eyes refocusing on the camera. I heard about my parents dying 2 years after I left. Got the information through a cousin I finally contacted once I felt safe enough. By then I'd been declared officially missing, presumed dead by some, presumed to have voluntarily disappeared by others. Coming back would have meant explanations, questions, maybe legal complications I wasn't equipped to handle. Marcus processed this, fitting Lisa's escape into the broader pattern. Did you know there was someone before you? Another woman who worked for Evelyn? Lisa's surprise was genuine. No. Evelyn told me I was the first person she'd hired since taking over management of the diner. Said she'd run it alone for years but was getting older, needed help, and I was lucky she'd chosen to trust me with the opportunity. There were others. Frank Hollis, retired cop, lives in town, thinks there might have been 3 or 4 women over a 30-year period. All of them arrived vulnerable. All of them disappeared without clear explanation. The implications settled across Lisa's face like physical weight. She's been doing this for decades. At least. And without your testimony about what she did to you, the case against her is limited to what happened with Sarah. Strong enough for charges, probably strong enough for conviction on assault and drugging. But not enough to establish pattern, not enough to bring in the earlier victims, not enough to make sure she never has the opportunity to try this again. Marcus leaned forward slightly. I'm not asking you to come back to the States. I'm not asking you to testify in person. But a video deposition, a sworn statement about what she did to you would make this case airtight. Lisa was silent for a long moment, weighing something that probably had more dimensions than Marcus could perceive. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd already fought this battle once and won at significant cost. If I do this, if I give you my testimony, you have to promise me something. What? That Sarah gets protected. Really protected, not just the legal minimum, because Evelyn doesn't give up, and even from jail she'll find ways to maintain control if she thinks there's any possibility of getting Sarah back. Lisa's eyes held the kind of knowledge that came from experience rather than speculation. Evelyn doesn't see people as human. We're assets, investments, things she's entitled to because she deigned to notice us when no one else did. And she will do everything in her power to reclaim what she believes belongs to her. Sarah's safe. She's in a hospital under medical supervision, and when she's discharged, she'll have housing and support that Evelyn can't access. That's not enough. You need legal protection, restraining orders, maybe witness protection, depending on how deep this goes. You need to make sure Sarah understands she's not just physically free, she's legally, financially, psychologically free. Because after years of being told you own nothing, not even yourself, freedom feels like falling rather than flying. The words landed with the weight of prophecy. Marcus filed them away, added them to the growing list of considerations that made this situation more complicated than simple rescue and prosecution. "I'll make sure Sarah has everything she needs. You have my word." Lisa studied him through the camera assessment that probably drew on 25 years of survival instincts. Whatever she saw must have passed muster because she nodded slowly. "All right, I'll give you a deposition. But I'm doing it through a Canadian lawyer on Canadian soil with legal protections that prevent extradition or harassment. And I want Sarah to know when she's ready to hear it that escape is possible. It's hard, it's terrifying, you lose parts of yourself you never get back. But it's possible." They arranged the logistics before ending the call. Lisa would contact a lawyer in Vancouver, prepare a formal statement, have it notarized, and transmitted to Marcus's lawyer in the States. The process would take a week, maybe two, but it would provide the historical foundation that transformed Sarah's case from isolated incident into pattern of predation. Marcus closed the laptop, rubbed his eyes against exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. Ash raised her head from where she'd been dozing on the motel room floor, checking whether this change in posture meant action was required. Not yet. He reached down to scratch behind her ears, felt some of the tension drain from his shoulders at the contact with something living that didn't require words or explanations. But soon, the hospital discharged Sarah 30 hours after admission with prescriptions for anxiety medication that wasn't benzodiazepines, a referral to a trauma therapist 3 towns over, and instructions to rest that seemed almost laughable given the circumstances. She had nowhere to rest. No possessions beyond the clothes she'd worn during the overdose attempt, and no clear path forward beyond avoiding the woman who'd controlled her life for 15 years. Marcus picked her up at 1400 hours in his truck with Ash riding shotgun. Sarah climbed into the back seat without question, moved with the mechanical compliance of someone defaulting to instruction following when decision-making felt too overwhelming. "Where am I going?" Her voice was quiet, stripped of the little inflection it had carried during their hospital conversation. "Motel for now. I've got a room with 2 beds and the manager doesn't care how many people use them as long as the bill gets paid. You'll be safe there while we figure out next steps." Sarah absorbed this without visible reaction, just stared out the window as the hospital gave way to town streets she'd walked for 15 years without ever really seeing as anything except the boundaries of her permitted territory. The motel room smelled like industrial cleaning solution and old carpet, not welcoming, but anonymous in a way that felt safer than anywhere associated with Evelyn. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, Marcus indicated, hands folded in her lap, posture suggesting she was waiting for instructions about what came next. "You're not my prisoner, and I'm not your new handler." Marcus kept his voice gentle but firm, establishing parameters that needed clarity. "You can stay here as long as you need, but you're free to leave whenever you want. Free to make your own decisions about what happens next. I know that probably sounds impossible right now, but it's true." Her eyes filled without spilling over. "I don't know how to make decisions. Every choice for 15 years, what to eat, when to sleep, what to wear, who to talk to. She made them all. And before that, my husband made them. I'm 39 years old and I've never actually been in charge of my own life." "Then this is where you learn." He pulled a chair over, sat facing her at eye level rather than looming. "Start small. What do you want for dinner? We can order in, go out, cook here if the kitchenette works. Your choice." Sarah stared at him like he'd posed a question in a language she'd studied years ago but never quite mastered. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I don't know what I want. I only know what I'm allowed to have. There's nothing you're allowed or not allowed anymore. There's just what you want and what you don't want. Even if you can't articulate the difference yet, we can work through options until you figure it out." It took 20 minutes to decide on pizza. Not because Sarah was being difficult, but because the concept of preference required accessing parts of her brain that had been dormant so long they'd nearly atrophied. She cycled through, apologizing for not being able to decide faster, asking what Marcus thought she should order, defaulting to whatever's easiest, until he gently but persistently redirected her back to the question of what she actually wanted to eat. When the pizza arrived, pepperoni and mushroom, a combination she'd tentatively identified as maybe possibly something she might enjoy. Sarah took 2 bites and started crying. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet tears that rolled down her face while she chewed and swallowed, like the act of eating food she'd chosen was so foreign it triggered emotional overflow. Marcus didn't comment on it, just slid the napkins closer and gave her space to process whatever was happening internally. The next morning brought Mark Delaney to the motel. The lawyer Marcus had contacted based on Frank's recommendation was a man in his early 60s with thinning hair and a beard trimmed too precisely to be natural, suggesting someone who'd learned professional presentation the hard way and maintained it through conscious effort. He carried a briefcase worn soft at the corners and had the kind of eyes that suggested he'd seen enough legal ugliness to be surprised by very little. He shook Marcus's hand, nodded to Sarah with the careful neutrality of someone who understood trauma, made handshakes complicated, and settled into the motel room's only chair while declining the offer of coffee. "I've reviewed the initial reports and the evidence collected so far. Evelyn Morse is currently facing charges of assault, administering a noxious substance, false imprisonment, and labor trafficking under federal statute." He pulled papers from the briefcase, organized them on the small table with practiced efficiency. "These are serious charges with significant prison time attached if convicted. However, I want to talk about a separate legal issue that came up during my preliminary investigation into the business structure of the diner." Sarah tensed visibly, shoulders drawing inward. "What kind of issue?" "Ownership. Specifically, who actually owns the property and business known as Mitchell's Diner." Mark pulled out a document that looked like it had been photocopied from official records, set it where both Marcus and Sarah could see. Current registration with the county lists Evelyn Morse as sole proprietor, acquired through transfer of ownership in 2006. The transfer documentation cites you as the previous owner who signed over rights to Ms. Morse in exchange for forgiveness of accumulated debts. Sarah's face went pale. I don't remember signing anything like that." "I didn't think you would, which is why I did some deeper digging." Mark produced another set of documents, these older and more worn. "These are the original property records from 20 years ago. They show that John and Mary Mitchell owned both the land and the building housing the diner, purchased outright in 1995. When they died in 2005, the property passed automatically to their sole heir, you, through standard inheritance law, since they died without a formal will." Sarah's breathing had gone shallow. Marcus watched her process information that was clearly triggering memories or reactions she couldn't quite articulate yet. "So, I owned it." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "The diner was mine." "Is yours technically, because the transfer document Evelyn used to claim ownership has some significant problems." Mark flipped to another page, pointed to specific sections. "First, the signature doesn't match your handwriting based on samples I obtained from your medical records at the hospital. Second, the notary stamp is from a notary public whose license was revoked in 2004 for fraudulent certifications. Third, the document was filed with the county clerk's office but never properly processed through the required channels for legitimate property transfers." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest as the implications cascaded. "Evelyn forged the documents." "That's my assessment, yes. She created a false transfer of ownership, filed it in a way that looked legitimate on the surface, and has been operating under fraudulent claim to the property for nearly 20 years. Mark's expression carried the grim satisfaction of someone who'd found exactly the smoking gun he'd suspected existed. "Which means Sarah is still the legal owner of the diner, the building, and the land it sits on. She's always been the owner. Evelyn just convinced her otherwise through fraudulent documentation and systematic psychological manipulation." The silence in the motel room felt heavy enough to have physical weight. Sarah stared at the documents spread across the table like they contained information written in code she couldn't crack. Her hands trembled when she reached out to touch the property deed, fingers tracing her parents' names with a reverence that suggested touching sacred relics. "My parents left me the diner." Not a question, just processing out loud. "They wanted me to have it, and Evelyn took it." "Yes. She didn't save me from losing it. She stole it while pretending to save me from my own incompetence." Sarah's voice was still quiet, but something harder was emerging underneath. "She stole 15 years of my life. And she stole the business my parents built, the legacy they wanted to leave me, the future they'd planned before they died." "That's accurate." Mark gathered the documents back into neat stacks. "Which gives us multiple avenues for legal action. We can pursue criminal charges for the forgery and fraud in addition to the assault and trafficking charges. We can file civil suit for return of the property and compensation for lost income over 20 years. And we can request immediate restraining orders preventing Evelyn from making any claims on you, the property, or your finances." Sarah looked at Marcus, seeking something he wasn't sure he could provide, reassurance maybe, or permission, or just confirmation that this wasn't another manipulation disguised as help. "This is real." He kept his voice steady, anchoring. "You actually own the diner. You've owned it this entire time. Evelyn's been running a business that belonged to you while keeping you prisoner through lies about debt and obligation." The tears that had threatened earlier finally broke through. Sarah bent forward, hands covering her face. sobs coming in waves that suggested years of accumulated grief finally finding outlet. Marcus let her cry, didn't try to comfort or redirect, just maintained presence while she processed the magnitude of theft that extended beyond property into identity itself. When she finally raised her head, eyes red and face blotchy, her voice came out raw but clearer than he'd heard it before. "I want to prosecute her for everything. Every crime, every lie, every year she stole, and I want my diner back." Mark Delaney smiled, the expression carrying approval that probably meant more coming from a lawyer who'd seen too many victims choose silence over justice. "Then let's make sure you get exactly that." The legal machinery began grinding forward with the momentum of cases that had clear villains and sympathetic victims. Mark filed motions for restraining orders that got approved within 24 hours. He submitted the fraudulent transfer documents to the district attorney's office along with expert analysis confirming the forgery. He initiated proceedings to have the property title corrected to reflect Sarah's continuous ownership. Evelyn, from her jail cell awaiting arraignment, fought back with the resources available to someone who'd been running a business on someone else's property for 2 decades. She hired her own lawyer, a man from the state capitol with the kind of reputation that suggested he specialized in defending the indefensible. Her bail hearing became contentious when the lawyer argued she was a pillar of the community, being railroaded by an unstable former employee with an axe to grind. The judge denied bail anyway, citing flight risk and the seriousness of charges that included attempted murder. But Evelyn's lawyer filed immediate appeals, started building a defense that painted Sarah as mentally incompetent, Marcus as an outside agitator with unclear motives, and Evelyn as a misunderstood businesswoman whose only crime was trying to help someone who proved ungrateful. Marcus watched it all unfold from the periphery, recognized the tactics from interrogations he'd conducted in less formal settings, where truth mattered less than who could construct the more convincing narrative. The difference here was documentation. Years of it. Evelyn had kept meticulous records of Sarah's supposed debt, every meal and room charge calculated down to the penny, presented as evidence of legitimate business arrangement. What she'd meant as proof of Sarah's obligation instead became proof of the systematic exploitation. Frank provided additional context through connections that hadn't entirely dissolved with retirement. The hardware store owner admitted he'd thought it odd that Sarah never seemed to have money despite working constantly. The librarian confirmed Sarah had been coming in for years, always checking out books about business management and legal rights, like she'd been trying to educate herself toward escape, but never quite believed she deserved the information. The pattern that emerged was one of perfect predation. Evelyn had selected victims whose vulnerabilities made them dependent, whose isolation made them invisible, whose desperation made them compliant. She'd maintained control through calculated combination of chemical dependency, financial fraud, and psychological manipulation, sophisticated enough to make the cage feel like shelter, until the door finally opened and revealed it had never been locked with anything except fear. Sarah spent a week at the motel learning how to make decisions. Small ones at first: what to eat, when to sleep, whether to take a walk or stay inside. Marcus provided structure without control options, without demands, presence without expectation. Ash helped more than either of them probably realized, giving Sarah something to care for that didn't judge or require justification. The shepherd seemed to understand that her role had shifted from threat detection to emotional support, spending hours lying with her head on Sarah's lap while the woman worked through panic attacks triggered by the simple act of choosing her own clothing. On day 8, Sarah asked to see the diner. Not to go inside yet, just to see it from the outside now that she knew it belonged to her, rather than to the woman who'd used ownership as weapon. They drove over at dusk when the street was quiet and the building sat dark and empty. Yellow police tape still stretched across the doors from the initial investigation. Sarah stood on the sidewalk across the street, staring at the structure that had been both workplace and prison, trying to reconcile what she'd believed about it with what she now knew to be true. "My parents built this." Her breath fogged in the cold air, words emerging slow and deliberate. "My dad did a lot of the renovation himself. My mom designed the interior, picked out the booths and the counter stools. They wanted to create something that would last, something they could pass to me when they were ready to retire." Marcus waited, giving her space to process. And Evelyn took it. Not just the building, but the memories, the connection to them. "She made me believe I'd failed them by not being capable of running it myself, made me think working for her was penance for my inadequacy." Sarah's hands curled into fists at her sides. "Every day for 15 years I walked into a place that should have been mine and believed I was only there because she allowed it, because she was kind enough to let me work off a debt that never existed. She can't do that anymore." "No, but she already did it. And those years, I can't get them back. I can't undo the fear or the exhaustion or the way she convinced me I was worthless except as labor." Sarah turned to face Marcus, eyes reflecting streetlight and something harder underneath. Everyone keeps telling me I'm free now, and legally, physically, maybe I am. But in here, she tapped her temple. I'm still trapped, still hearing her voice telling me I owe her, still feeling the panic when I have to make decisions, still unable to believe any of this is real. That's what therapy is for. Processing the trauma, rebuilding the parts of yourself she damaged, learning to trust your own judgment again. Marcus kept his tone even, stating facts without minimizing the difficulty. It's going to take time, probably years, but you've already started. Every decision you make, every night you sleep without her voice in your head, every moment you choose something for yourself instead of accepting what you're told to want, that's progress. Sarah looked back at the diner, studied it with new attention. I think I want to keep it, not run it myself, at least not yet. But keep it, renovate it, turn it into something good, instead of letting it stay associated with what she did. Her voice gained strength as the idea solidified. Make it a place where people are actually safe, instead of just told they are. Where nobody works off imaginary debts or gets drugged into compliance. That's a good plan. I'll need help. Financial advice, business planning, probably contractors to fix everything she let deteriorate while she was stealing my income. Sarah paused. And I'll need someone to make sure I don't fall into the same pattern she used. Someone who'll tell me if I start exploiting people even accidentally because it's what I learned. You won't. Marcus said it with certainty that came from weeks of observation. People who've been controlled don't become controllers. They recognize the mechanisms too well. You'll be hypervigilant about power dynamics, probably to the point of overcorrecting and being too lenient. Maybe. But I want the safety net anyway. She pulled her jacket tighter against wind that had picked up, carrying the smell of snow from the north. When this goes to trial, I'm going to have to testify. Tell everything that happened. Answer questions about why I didn't leave sooner. Explain how someone could be that afraid of someone who was supposedly helping them. You will, and Lisa's testimony will support yours, establish that this was a pattern, not an isolated incident. Sarah's head turned sharply. Lisa, you found her. Marcus realized he hadn't shared that development yet too, focused on the property fraud to circle back to the earlier investigation. She's alive, living in Canada. She escaped 25 years ago and never came back because she was too afraid Evelyn would find her. The information settled across Sarah's features with visible impact. She got out. She actually got away. And she wants you to know it's possible. That the damage Evelyn caused is real and permanent in some ways, but that survival is possible too. Building a new life is possible. Marcus watched Sarah process this, saw something shift in her expression from despair towards something that might eventually become hope. She's giving a deposition for the trial. Her testimony about what Evelyn did to her combined with yours about what Evelyn did to you will make the pattern undeniable. I want to talk to her. Sarah's words came quick, urgent. Not now, but eventually. I want to hear from someone who got through this and survived what comes after. I'll arrange it when you're ready. They stood in silence for another few minutes, watching the diner fade into darkness as twilight completed its transition to night. Finally, Sarah turned away, headed back toward the truck where Ash waited in the passenger seat. I'm ready to go now, but I'll come back. When this is all over and the building is mine for real, legally and emotionally, I'll come back and make it what it should have been all along. The arraignment happened on a gray Tuesday morning when the courthouse smelled like wet wool and too many bodies pressed into spaces designed for smaller crowds. Evelyn appeared via video link from the county jail, her wine-colored sweater replaced by orange jumpsuit that stripped away the authority her civilian clothes had projected. She looked smaller on the screen, diminished, but her eyes still held the cold calculation that came from decades of successful predation. The charges were read in clinical legal language that somehow made them sound both more and less serious than the lived reality they described. Assault with intent to cause bodily harm, administering a noxious substance without consent, fraud through falsification of documents, labor trafficking through debt bondage. Each count carried its own potential sentence, the numbers adding up to a possible lifetime behind bars for a woman who'd already lived 60-something years in apparent respectability. Evelyn's lawyer entered a plea of not guilty on all counts, which surprised no one. The legal choreography continued with motions and counter-motions, arguments about evidence, admissibility, and witness credibility. The prosecution presented Sarah's medical records showing benzodiazepine levels consistent with long-term administration. The defense argued Sarah could have been taking the medication voluntarily and only claimed otherwise after meeting Marcus, whose motives remained unclear. The judge, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and an expression suggesting she'd presided over enough cases to recognize patterns, listened with visible impatience to the defense's attempt to paint Sarah as unreliable. When Evelyn's lawyer suggested that perhaps Sarah's mental state made her an unfit witness to her own experience, the judge's eyes narrowed. "Counsel, are you seriously arguing that the victim of systematic drugging is unreliable specifically because she was systematically drugged?" The lawyer attempted to clarify, which only made it worse. The judge cut him off. Set a trial date 3 months out to allow time for discovery and deposition of witnesses, including Lisa Brennan, and remanded Evelyn to custody without bail, based on the seriousness of charges and evidence of sophisticated planning that suggested flight risk. Evelyn's face on the screen went rigid with rage, barely contained. Her mouth opened as if to speak, thought better of it, closed again. But her eyes found Sarah in the courtroom gallery, locked on her with an intensity that felt physical even through digital transmission. The message in that stare was clear: this wasn't over. Legal proceedings were just one battlefield, and Evelyn had been fighting wars of control for decades before Sarah learned what weapons existed. After the arraignment, Mark Delaney pulled Marcus aside in the courthouse hallway while Sarah used the restroom and attempted to stop shaking. "We need to talk about security." The lawyer kept his voice low, professional concern bleeding through careful phrasing. "Evelyn's in custody now, but she's been running that diner for 35 years. She has connections, people who owe her favors, relationships built on shared secrets. I've seen cases like this before where defendants maintain control from behind bars through proxies. You think she'll try something? I think she'll try everything. Intimidation, harassment, possibly physical threats if she can find someone willing to act on her behalf." Mark glanced toward the restroom door, confirming Sarah was still out of earshot. "Sarah's vulnerable right now, physically safe but psychologically fragile. If Evelyn can get to her through intimidation or make her doubt the case, make her believe testifying will result in worse consequences than staying silent, the whole prosecution gets significantly weaker." Marcus had been thinking along similar lines since the moment Evelyn's stare had transmitted such pure malice across the courtroom. "What do you recommend? Restraining orders are already in place, but they're just paper. Sarah needs actual protection somewhere. Evelyn's associates can't find her communication security that prevents harassment, probably a victim advocate who specializes in trafficking cases to help her navigate what's coming." Mark shifted his briefcase from one hand to the other, the gesture suggesting discomfort with what he was about to say next. "And she needs you to understand that protecting her means more than just being present. It means being prepared for escalation." "I spent 20 years preparing for escalation. It's what I do. This isn't Afghanistan. You can't just neutralize threats through superior firepower." The lawyer's expression carried the weight of too many cases where good intentions collided with legal reality. "Whatever you're planning, make sure it stays on the right side of the law. Sarah doesn't need her defender turning into another person who controls her life through violence, even justified violence." The words landed harder than Marcus wanted to acknowledge. He'd been thinking in tactical terms, running scenarios for how to counter various threats, defaulting to training that emphasized decisive action over measured response. But Mark was right. Sarah had escaped one cage. Protecting her couldn't mean building another one with different bars. Sarah emerged from the restroom looking pale but composed, the kind of surface calm that came from years of hiding internal collapse. She walked over to where they stood, positioned herself slightly behind Marcus like he was a barrier between her and the courthouse full of strangers. "Can we leave now?" Her voice carried the thin edge of someone barely maintaining. They left through a side exit to avoid media that had started gathering once word spread about the unusual case: small-town business owner charged with decades of systematic abuse victim who turned out to own the business she'd thought she was merely allowed to work at. The narrative had elements that attracted attention, human interest combined with legal complexity that made good copy. Marcus drove Sarah back to the motel through streets that felt different now, charged with the awareness that Evelyn's reach extended beyond jail cells and legal documents. He found himself checking mirrors more frequently, noting vehicles that appeared multiple times in their route, cataloging faces that seemed to pay too much attention to the truck's passage. Ash, riding in the back seat next to Sarah, maintained alert posture that suggested she'd picked up on the tension, even without specific threat indicators. Her training had included reading her handler's stress levels, responding to changes in environment that signaled potential danger. Right now, every line of her body communicated readiness. Back at the motel, Marcus did a sweep of the room before letting Sarah enter. Checked locks, tested windows, confirmed nothing had been disturbed during their absence. Probably paranoid, definitely excessive by civilian standards, but habits died hard, and the alternative was vulnerability he wasn't willing to risk. Sarah watched him complete the security check with an expression that mixed gratitude and exhaustion. when he finally indicated the room was clear. She moved to sit on her bed with the heaviness of someone whose emotional reserves had hit empty. How long does this last? She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapped arms around them in a posture that made her look younger than 39. The fear that she's going to find a way to hurt me, even from jail. The certainty that I'm not actually safe no matter what anyone tells me. Marcus considered lying, offering reassurance that would feel good in the moment but ultimately prove false. Decided on truth instead. I don't know. Probably longer than either of us wants. Maybe forever at some level. He sat in the chair across from her, close enough to be present without crowding. But it gets more manageable. The fear becomes background noise instead of constant alarm. You learn to function with it, rather than letting it paralyze you. That sounds exhausting. It is. But so is being trapped. At least this version of exhausting, you're free while you're tired. Sarah almost smiled, the expression flickering across her face and vanishing before fully forming. Lisa managed it. She's been free for 25 years, built a whole new life, survived whatever comes after. The words were clearly meant to be encouraging but came out sounding hollow. If she could do it, I can do it. You will do it. Marcus kept his voice firm certainty rather than reassurance. You already are doing it. Every day that passes where you're not under Evelyn's control is proof the cage is broken, even if the scars remain. Outside, snow had started falling in the kind of soft, persistent way that meant accumulation rather than just atmospheric decoration. The motel parking lot turned white, slowly erasing tire tracks and footprints, leaving clean surfaces that would show any new intrusion clearly. Marcus watched it fall and thought about patterns. How predators found prey, how victims learned to survive, how systems of control maintained themselves through fear that outlasted physical captivity. Evelyn might be behind bars, but her influence remained coded into Sarah's instincts and memories and expectations about how the world worked. Breaking that influence would take more than legal victories. It would require Sarah to believe at a level deeper than conscious thought that she deserved freedom and safety and the right to make her own choices. That belief couldn't be imposed from outside. Marcus could provide protection, Mark could provide legal advocacy therapy, could provide tools for processing trauma. But the fundamental shift from victim to survivor that Sarah had to choose for herself. And judging by the way she sat now watching snow fall through the motel window with an expression that suggested she was seeing something beyond the present moment, that choice was still being negotiated in the internal spaces where Evelyn's voice competed against the possibility of different futures. The phone call came at 0200 hours, jolting Marcus from the light sleep he'd learned to maintain during deployments where deep rest meant vulnerability. Unknown number again. Local area code. He answered before it could ring twice and wake Sarah. No voice on the other end, just breathing. Deliberate, measured, the kind that communicated presence as threat rather than accident. Marcus stayed silent, waiting. Finally, tell Sarah she can't hide forever. The voice was male, older, carrying an accent that suggested decades in this region. Tell her some debts don't get erased by lawyers and courtrooms. Tell her Evelyn has friends who remember loyalty. The line went dead before Marcus could respond. He sat in darkness for several minutes, phone in hand, running threat assessment protocols. Anonymous call. Vague warning. No specific action threatened. Could be genuine danger. Could be psychological harassment designed to destabilize Sarah's sense of security. Either way, it meant Evelyn's reach extended beyond her physical location. He didn't wake Sarah to tell her about the call. She'd find out soon enough if it escalated beyond words. For now, sleep was more valuable than fear. But Marcus didn't go back to sleep. He sat in the chair by the window watching the parking lot turn white under persistent snowfall and planned for contingencies that might never materialize but couldn't be ignored. Ash lay near Sarah's bed, head raised now, watching Marcus with eyes that reflected ambient light and communicated understanding that the watch had begun again.